All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Office Hours, where we answer questions, give philosophical perspectives, formulate and explore arguments, and deep dive into particular topics of your choice. Jay writes, and this is fairly broad. They say, argue against polyamory, and they specify to give special attention to the love is not finite claim. And again, fairly broad. This was sort of inspired, I think, by an initial question on Instagram that was then elaborated upon. And here we are with a longer form video. So let's get into it. This feels like a very current issue question. A lot of the questions in philosophy are sort of timeless. But the question of monogamy or polyamory, and the question of marriage in particular, seems very specific to our time. You know, monogamy is sort of the default position. It's supported by tradition. It's been the sort of backbone of civilization, as some people like to say. But in recent years, a lot of things seem to have changed. In the last century in particular, we now have the advent of hormonal birth control, which has reduced the cost of hooking up, and it's resulted in some hormone changes that make relationships a little different, and it has a fairly well established negative effect on marriage longevity. No fault divorce became a thing under Ronald Reagan, if my history recollection is correct. That conservative bastion of Christian values. I'm not trying to criticize. I think there actually could be a case for no fault divorce. Perhaps it's we'll get to that in a little bit. But this has obviously had a negative effect on the longevity of marriage as measured by divorce. And now we're at a stage where we seem to have something like a 50% divorce rate. Put an asterisk there. We'll get back to that as well. So yeah, we've got birth control, we've got no fault divorce, and then a big one, we have the internet. The internet has created this plenty of fish effect, where we are seeing and interacting with so many more people, like me, for example, that it can be easy to run into what Roy Rappaport calls the problem of alternative, or as the University of Washington economics comedian says, the problem of choosing between one Snickers bar and an identical alternative Snickers bar. How do you choose? It's an economics joke, but it's a real problem in the age of the internet, where you're just bombarded with thousands upon thousands upon thousands of images of other people that are refined, perfected, just the superficial image that make it's easy to think, oh, I've got so many more options. Maybe my partner isn't all I thought they were. And the secondary effect of this is not just seeing all these other people, this plenty of fish effect, but it also seems to be making people less attractive. They are more distracted. They are less friendly. Because they don't have to be. Because all of our relationships have become more weak tie relationships. Because of that same plenty of fish phenomenon. It's easier to find people, new people to make friends with, so the cost of burning bridges is lower. And of course, all this time looking down at our phones, sitting at desks, as I am now, has not done wonders for our bodies either. So, the internet has put, monogamous relationships under its own kind of stress from a wide variety of different angles. And I didn't even think of including porn in my notes. That's a big one too. We'll have to save that one for another time. But porn, we can just attach that to the internet, and we'll talk about the psychology behind porn and other addictions in a little bit anyways. But I think one of the most interesting arguments, and so these three, the birth control, no-fault divorce, the internet, they culminate into a kind of argument that marriage is just kind of outmoded. Maybe we don't like it, but hey, here we are. It is what it is. Monogamy, marriage, they just don't make sense in a world. The benefits just don't add up. If you're a man, divorce can cost you not everything, but half of everything. And, the not to mention the lawyer fees, which are not small, usually. And so, like, why bother with that? And then, on the other side of that, you have a positive argument for something else, something besides marriage, which we might call polyamory. A book came out in, I want to say 2011, called Sex at Dawn. There have been a number of books that have made these kinds of arguments that maybe humans aren't really meant to be monogamous. If you look at the shape of the penis, the human penis, if you look at the phenomenon of hidden ovulation or naturally engorged breasts, most mammals don't do that. They only fill with milk when the woman or the female, I should say, has offspring to feed. The very, very late stages of pregnancy and through the bringing of the child. Humans aren't quite like that. We have many women, I should say, maybe not all, but many of our women have natural large breasts as if they were engorged with milk. What's the evolutionary purpose of that? Well, it appears to be to hide ovulation and estrus, to hide their fertile window. What's the point of that? Well, maybe some psychologists suggest there's reasons to think we're not really monogamous species after all. We're not like, wolves or birds. We're a lot more like chimps or bonobos, as the case may be. Maybe we're more like if not a masculine tournament harem species like horses, maybe we're just hunter-gatherer sex parties like bonobos. And so perhaps monogamy is somewhat at odds with nature. So with these negative arguments that are tied contextually to largely technological problems in the present, birth control is technology, obviously. No-fault divorce is sort of more of a social technology or a legal change, but same idea. And of course, coupled with these scientific ideas coming out about our true nature, maybe monogamy, maybe marriage doesn't make sense anymore. So maybe monogamy doesn't make sense anymore, since marriage was the condition which made monogamy sensible. Maybe this thing called polyamory, which is literally love of many. So maybe I have a wife, maybe I have two wives, but those two wives see other people, and I see a few other girls and maybe a couple guys, on the side, and we all live in this happy little village where we just we have our wives in common, and our husbands in common, and we raise our children in common, and we just kind of enjoy each other generally. Maybe that's more natural. Maybe that's a more realistic model of love for how human beings really are, rather than how we want ourselves to be, or perhaps how we were trained to, what we were trained to desire. So this is, of course, a very brief summary of the arguments against marriage and the arguments against monogamy, but I think it's a fairly comprehensive one, or it's a good general overview of the sorts of things in the water that people are talking about when they talk about marriage, and whether it's sensible, is it economically stupid, as Aaron Clary will say. And if so, how do the advocates for marriage respond? Well, first, I think it's one of the things that I think a lot of the TradCon kinds of advocates for marriage, like the Matt Walshes of the world, don't take seriously enough, is that we do have these other instincts. We do have especially men, a desire for sexual variety. Women really do have a desire for hypergamy, which is to sort of trade up the social ladder. Those are real instincts. However, we do still want the one. We have this instinct for monogamy. Back in like 2014, 2015, I got really interested in the pickup artist world. They seemed to be the best social scientists around at the time. I never put this into practice, really. I've dated in my entire life three women total, which is a very low number, I think, for most guys. But I was fascinated by their reasoning and by their methodology. They would go out and try things, and their results were very good. And one of the complaints that the instructors would have of their students at these sort of pickup artist conferences, they would always try to talk men out of this in advance, is this phenomenon they called one-itis. And that is the man who's supposed to be this alpha male, this king that's learning to a degree of detachment and outcome independence, and just to be fun, say the right lines and say them in the right way and be in the right kind of frame of mind. And they lose that outcome independence because they fall for that one. They want that one person. They have this desire for connection, intimacy, and union, for what social anthropologists would call pair bonding. So it's true that we have these instincts for sexual variety and hypergamy, but we also have this desire for the one. And contrary to the red pill guys, women also have this desire. Men and women, I think, experience the desire for variety differently. Men kind of go across and down, women go kind of singular and up. But that desire for the one is very similar. And so we have instincts that are at odds with each other. What do we do with that? It makes it very hard to just kind of appeal to nature, because nature seems to be pointing in both directions, and you can't do both. Well, there's an asterisk there too, but generally speaking, the choice between polyamory and monogamy are exclusive. So how do we go about choosing? Let's walk through those 4 problems sort of step by step, and see if they hold up. And I think, broadly speaking, they don't, although they seem very powerful on the surface. So the first one is birth control. Now, it is true that birth control seems to be related to a decline in marriage success. And this isn't just correlational. It really looks causal. And when I say causal, I have to say I mean this logically, not statistically. It's kind of hard to prove. I'm sure some statisticians will make that claim, but you don't need the statistics to look at what birth control does and to understand why it would have a negative effect on relationships. First of all, and most obviously, it's screwing with women's hormones. It changes who they're attracted to. It changes their level of sexual desire very often, changes their physical appearance, changes how they perceive their partner, and not in good ways for the relationship. But I'm going to pair two things together that don't appear to be the same on the surface, and that's birth control and feminism. Now, feminism is not just female empowerment. This is like the sort of Mott and Bailey that feminists will sort of advance. It's like, oh, we just want equal rights for women. No, whatever is being advanced is not feminism by definition. It is not feminism unless it includes a narrative of male oppression called patriarchy. Stretching back through basically all of time, but crucially not all of time. Another asterisk there. We'll get back to the sex at dawn people. Signposting a little bit. And feminism was, in the water in the 1880s and that time, but it didn't really become viable as an ideology that could be put into action without birth control. I think birth control really made the feminist ideal actionable for large numbers of women. And that ideal was the replacement of relationship with freedom. Birth control freed women from the bonds of not so much children, but pregnancy. And so it made this ideal that was kind of a fantasy. It's like, oh, men get to do this and we get stuck at home and it's so miserable. And meanwhile, the guys are like, yay, I get to go to work instead of the home that I paid for. So the mutual resentment in both directions based on this misunderstanding. But suddenly, with the advent of birth control, there's this taste of choice at like an existential level. And I think birth control, aside from the hormones shenanigans, sort of brought feminism into being in a way. And the two sort of facilitated each other. Now, I don't know if birth control would have been as attractive without birth control would not have been as attractive without feminism, because again, feminism portrays your spouse as a force of oppression. So of course you're ever so slightly, subconsciously perhaps, going to want to deny a little bit from them, to take some freedom back from your oppressor and make your choices on your own. Now, we're not talking just about what has happened descriptively, but again, the point of this question is, defending monogamy and arguing against polyamory. The question is, which is better? Which is better, polyamory or monogamy? And insofar as feminism and birth control have eroded the integrity and the stability of monogamy, has that been a good thing? The evidence we have suggests it hasn't made women happier. The ideology has not made women happier. Perhaps it's made them more free, and perhaps a philosophically inclined feminist might say, well, some period of unhappiness might be necessary for us to learn how to be happy with real freedom. Like, a slave could be happy, and then the first, couple generations his descendants are free might be more challenging, but that's not an argument to not be free. You could imagine them saying something like that. I would respond to that by saying, well, any commitment is going to be a kind of, enslavement. The men in these relationships aren't exactly these carefree cads that get to do whatever they want either. And it's hard to really appreciate anything of depth in that careless, attachment-free way. That's a very it's a very low sense of what happiness means. And the moment you decide to say, I think this is something really worthwhile, I want to commit to that, bam, you're back to patriarchy. Maybe it's not men that are in charge, maybe it's something else. So you kind of have to choose your masters in life. I'm not saying men should be your master. Maybe your marriage is your master. But I think many women are discovering that in giving up men, freedom looked a lot like their job becoming their master. And it was a lot emptier than it sounded on paper. So, anyways, a digression, I think. There's a much stronger point to be made about connection that we'll get back to in a little bit. I'm sorry, so many of these things interweave and overlap that there's a lot of thematic crossover. So anyways, aside from the ideology not making women happier, the birth control itself has independently made women a lot less happy for all of the hormonal reasons you would kind of expect. Some of the more tragic things have been reports of women losing sensation in certain critical areas. Long-standing health concerns, and many women, especially millennials and Gen Z women, have actually decided to voluntarily go off birth control or to never take it. My wife was among them, as it happens. And the reasons that they give are interesting. There are specific health concerns, things like, heart problems, and there are people like Tom Nichols who complain about people don't trust experts anymore because they're so narcissistic. Well, no, many people feel lied to and manipulated by experts because doctors have been mass prescribing birth control pills to girls as young as 13 or 14 for everything under the sun, including acne, without a moment's consideration of their diet or something more reasonable, only to find out that it's leaving permanent effects and it's screwing with their hormones in very dramatic ways. Sometimes they can never become fertile again. That has happened to a number of women, and they say we didn't know this. You didn't tell us this. Sometimes the doctors knew this and didn't tell the women, so people don't trust the doctors anymore. So there are specific health concerns, pertaining to long-term infertility and heart problems. There are also general well-being concerns about hormones, but I think the most interesting answer that many of these women have given to say to say no to birth control pills is that it gives them a reason to say no to men. Now, in the sort of hookup culture of the 21st century, if a man comes to you and says, "Hey, we should have sex," if the woman says, "No, I really don't want to, I don't feel comfortable with this," if there's no risk of pregnancy, and if you're reasonably sure each other are clean, presumably you had tests or whatever, it can be very socially awkward and very socially difficult to say no, because what are you protecting exactly? Some vague religious notion of the sanctity of your own body? Well, what's the justification for saying no? It becomes very awkward to justify. And it's one of I think the supreme ironies of feminism in particular is in freeing women from their, the constraints of childbearing. It has actually taken away reasons for women to assert authority over their own bodies sexually, or so report thousands of women who are talking about doing this, saying, "No, I'm going to not be on birth control so that sex actually means something, that there's some risk there, and that gives me a very powerful reason for, if someone who I look at and like, I absolutely would not want to have kids with this person, they can say no with some gravitas, with some certainty. It's strangely empowering based on their own biology that they have been fleeing from in previous generations. So I think birth control will almost certainly always be with us. Hormonal birth control, it's not like they're going to stop, but I think a lot fewer people are going to be on it, and continued birth control is not some like culturally foregone conclusion, and I don't think its effect on marriage in the long run is going to be as negative as it is at the present. And there are signs that it's already on the decline. So what about divorce? Divorce is a big one. Before I get into the 50% divorce stat, which I have gone into at length elsewhere, I'll include a link to the blog. Actually, I'll just mention it right now. The divorce statistics are generally overblown. I wrote a blog post back in October of last year, 2023, called The 50% Divorce Rate and Other Marital Myths. Let me read a little bit of it here. Click over here. Yeah, sure. I'll read like 4 or 5 paragraphs. The myth of the 50% divorce rate in America emerged in the 1980s, which happened to be about the peak of divorce rates in America. Though it has declined since then, even at the time it was nonsense. Statistics-based criticisms of the numbers go back at least to 1993, where it was calculated that in the worst year, which was 1979, the divorce rate was 22.8. Not good, but hardly a coin flip. The 50% myth emerged, as one might have guessed when statistics are involved, with a projection from the 1970s based on a trend of increases in divorce. In other words, they looked at a bar graph at an upward line, and they said, if this line continues, then we'll have 50% this year. Now, the projection never came true. Never actually even came close to being true. But at that point, the number had stuck in people's heads and somehow remains with us to this day. And as a rule of thumb, any statement preceded by "if current trends continue" can just be ignored. And in fact, bet against. Current trends never continue. However, if you look at the CDC and other sources, one finds many law firms supplying this kind of information. You will still see numbers in the 40% to 50% range. Forbes, for example, says it's true that half of all marriages end in divorce. But that's only first marriages. It's much worse for second and third marriages. However, when you follow their sources and actually click their hyperlink that they're citing when they say that, it takes you to a 2012 article from Psychology Today. And the article says, statistics have shown that in the U.S., 50% of first marriages end in divorce. And it shows no statistics. There's no source. There's no data. It's simply asserted. So this is data laundering. A number gets picked up and published in one place, then it's cited somewhere else using the credibility of the original source, when in fact the emperor never at any point had a loincloth on. Now, we need not throw out the baby with the bathwater. Indeed, we don't need to look at any data at all to grasp the intuitive sensibility of the idea that second and third marriages... Okay, I guess I'm getting into the logic of second and third and subsequent divorcees. People who are bad at their first marriage are more likely to be bad in their second marriage. It doesn't take any statistics to understand that. But the important point is the way that we got to this 50% divorce rate. It was complete... this is my own channel, so I can say it. It's complete bullshit. It was always bullshit, even back in the 70s when they first projected this. The logic was bad. I think there was a point in the 80s where we did hit just over 42% or something like that. The best data I've seen, the most reliable data I've seen was the book Coming Apart by Charles... God, I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. The book is Coming Apart. It's got very, very good divorce data in there. But even that you have to take with a bit of a grain of salt. But anyways, it's also worth pointing out here that the divorce stats maybe don't matter as much as people think they do when it comes to what's better. And I was just listening to a conversation a few days ago, actually, between Matt Walsh and a divorce attorney named James Sexton, who's been kind of making the rounds in the podcast world. And he gave a first of all, he believes the 50% divorce stat, so, I might disagree with him on that point. But he gave a very fascinating statistic towards the end of their conversation. And he said, divorces are always a possibility and they suck and it's awful. However, he says, it's worth remembering that 87% of divorcees are remarried again within 3 years. Think about that. Like, that's the desire for marriage is real. And these are the disillusioned people. These are the people who went through the horrors of divorce and the heart-rending tragedy of it, and they went right back in the ring. Now, are all of them stupid? Or maybe, does it reveal something about what people think is worthwhile? As James Sexton says, the possibility of failure is not a reason to not try. It just means no outcomes are guaranteed. So the divorce point, I think, is one of the most damaging things to in the male side of questioning the wisdom of monogamy and marriage in particular. And it's particularly pernicious because we have this tendency to pay more attention to the more noteworthy stories, which are our friends who get divorced. So when you see, there's a 50% divorce rate, it immediately clicks in your mind those examples of your friends who went through super messy divorces and it was really gross, and someone, crashed the car intentionally and it was all bitter and vindictive. And you don't immediately think of your 6 other friends who are happily married because there's nothing to think about. Everything is going smoothly. It doesn't come to your attention in the way that some kind of dramatic train wreck does. So it's a psychologically pernicious myth. But divorce has actually been on the decline for the last couple decades. But 3, the internet. The internet is an interesting one. It is certainly true that the internet is changing us. However, the parts of it that are damaging marriages and monogamy and relationships are also damaging us in other ways. This is not just going to continue unchecked. This is another one of those if current trends continue kinds of setups. There is a growing market for, if not internet therapy, then at least, habits or perhaps technologies and other means of curtailing and controlling our addiction to the parts of the internet that damage or destroy our relationships in the real world. I guess by means of metaphor and analogy, it's worth bringing up something similar. Nick Bostrom kind of hit the philosophical stage with his simulation theory. This was back in, I want to say 2001, somewhere thereabouts, where he basically, using mathematics and the possibilities of a sort of infinite regress of simulations, what he calls ancestor simulations. He said, basically, believable ancestor simulations are inevitable technologically. So And simulations, once you can make simulations that are believable, you can make simulations within the simulations. Which means that in a world where there are, lifelike ancestor simulations, a given phenomena experiencing entity like ourselves is infinitely more likely to occupy a simulation than the one objective physical real world. So he says one of three things must be true. One, we destroy ourselves as a species before we achieve believable, lifelike ancestor simulations. Or two, we lose interest in ancestor simulations. Or three, we are already living in a simulation. Hence the simulation hypothesis within the simulation theory. And everyone is always obsessed with the first and the third hypothesis. But it seems like no one ever dwells on the second hypothesis, the possibility that we might lose interest in ancestor simulations. And I think for a wide range of reasons, the second possibility is actually the most likely. The second hypothesis, that we lose interest in ancestor simulations, will be the norm. That's not to say that there won't be ancestor simulations. Some people going down that world, but the scale of those will be very small and perhaps even legally banned in some cases. And the mathematics nerds will say, "Oh man, it only takes one simulation to make simulations within simulations, and the number of entities." And I think there are energy problems that aren't accounted for there, because there's energy inefficiencies in running these kinds of simulations. I don't want to get into a physics argument about solid state processors and whatever, but yeah, I think the second option that Nick Bostrom lists as a possibility, that we lose interest, is real. And I think there is a good chance that over time we will, if not lose interest in the parts of the internet, the dating apps, the worst parts of social media, the pornography websites, those things, I think we will learn techniques and social habits to constrain ourselves in that way, much as we largely have done with alcohol. Now, am I saying there are no drunks anymore? Absolutely not. Of course there are drunks. But look at all the laws we have, all the restrictions we have made that still allow people to drink quite a bit, probably beyond what's good for them. But we don't let very young people do it, generally speaking. We don't let you drive while you do it. And there are social taboos against, for example, drinking before 5 p.m. You can't be drinking on the job. You can't be drinking while operating heavy equipment. You're thought of as a bad person and a bad parent if you're drinking while watching your kid. We have all these social taboos against drinking in the wrong way and in the wrong context. And I think we are going to come to a sort of etiquette system like that for the internet, because we have to, or else we won't have relationships, and not just monogamous marriage relationships, but even like friendships, not in the real sense. And I think our desire for connection is stronger than our desire for the internet, because so much of the internet is a thin attempt to replicate the experience of connection. That's what social media is. That's what OnlyFans is, in the dating world. And, people do have a sense that it's not the real thing. Once the novelty wears off, and the novelty, I don't want to bet that the novelty will wear off. I don't think we'll lose interest in social media and things like that. It's touching too deep of a part of our brain for us to just get bored of it. I think more likely is we will come up with tools to restrain ourselves a little bit more effectively. And this, again, that doesn't mean that many people won't get sucked in and stay there, alcoholics. But understanding the influence of the internet in these ways, I think I think it will change what we consider desirable when it comes to the question of monogamy versus polyamory. If we think, oh, the advent of the internet has made monogamy not feasible. I don't think that's currently true, and I don't think that's like in our near future either. And again, just like with birth control, there are hints of shifts all of in this direction already. We see the phenomenon of light phones, for example, the phones that don't have a lot of these apps that aren't connected to the internet all the time. I myself was using a flip phone, like a T9 flip phone, up until I got my most recent job, and then I had to get a regular phone in order to clock in with their app. But the minute they don't rely on that anymore, which they probably will, I'll probably always need a phone. But maybe I'll get a company specific phone that just has that one app, so I can just do that. People can begin to move away from these things, and this has to happen, or else we will just get outbred by the Muslims and the Amish, and they can compete for genetic dominance in the world. And again, this doesn't mean we give up on the internet, but we're just talking about restraints on the most addictive and destructive parts of it. Actually, this is an interesting week for that, because if my memory is correct, a bunch of states are banning Pornhub. So, yeah, we're already seeing bits of that coming into play. So, anyways, but this leaves the sort of positive argument for polyamory to address. Were we even designed for marriage? We certainly have the desire for a single person, but it's also true that we have a desire for more than just that. There are mammals that mate for life. There are wolves do this, coyotes do this, some species of mice, outside of mammals, many birds. And our closest relative, I think, that mates for life are the gibbons, a sort of long-armed monkey. But most of our cousins don't. Most of our hominoid cousins, the bonobos and chimps and gorillas and that crew, they don't. They have a tournament model. At least chimps and gorillas do. Bonobos are doing their own thing. So the question is, which are we? Are we more like wolves or gibbons? Or are we more like chimps? Descriptively, we're neither. Or both. Depending on, how you want to frame it. Just descriptively speaking. But we are largely monogamous. But the fact that we do both leaves the option open. Which would you which would you prefer to be? And I wanted to take a second, just a brief digression. The Sex at Dawn people point out all these evolutionary features that describe either a tournament mating model or a non-polygamous model, which is a one man, many women. Maybe it's just many women and many men. They talk about hidden estrus and these other things, but there are also evolutionary features that seem to suggest pair bonding, like male hormone cycle matching. So if a man is sleeping with a woman regularly, and this doesn't have to involve sex, even just sleeping in proximity to, his own testosterone cycles will begin to match and follow the woman's ovulation cycle. His testosterone will peak and spike when she is ovulating, and it will go down to a low point when she is on her period. So he'll be that like alpha male while she's ovulating, and he'll be the comforting protector and provider while she is, at her most vulnerable, sensitive state. And I think that is a sort of chemical. It's not proof of anything. None of this is proof of anything, but it could be taken as evidence for adaptation to monogamy, as much as these other physical features might be taken as evidence of non-monogamy. So again, it comes down to choice, which we could be either one. Which one should we choose? From an evolutionary psych perspective, I think there are three sort of practical reasons that have guided us more towards monogamy. The first and most obvious one is there's a benefit to the children. There is in the world of genetics and heredity a theory called RK selection. R selection is basically a quantity bias, and K selection is basically a quality bias. Now there's no moral judgment meant in these things. That they both make sense depending on the environment. The usual way it's phrased is R selection makes more sense if the species doesn't have a lot of control over its environment. Like if you're a rabbit and a hawk could just come down out of nowhere and there isn't much you can do, it makes more sense just to have lots of babies rather than, you have one baby and you invest tremendous amounts of time and effort in training this baby to be the best possible rabbit it can be, and then poof, there he goes. That's not a very good strategy if you're a rabbit. However, if you are a wolf and your offspring need a lot of skill and practice, and they need to observe a lot and to learn a lot, and learning how to hunt properly, how to track game properly, how to get along with the pack properly. They need not just instinct, but they need instruction. They need training and modeling. Maybe training is a bit too anthropomorphic for a wolf, but they need more parental investment. And if they get that parental investment, that wolf's going to do really well, hopefully. So this is not about quality genes, right? This is about what works in an environment. Because you could have really, really high quality R genes or really, really high quality K genes. But with humans, I think the R selection tends to do better. Now that's debatable. That's arguable. Maybe this is an aesthetic preference. But it seemed that the kids in an R-selected setting seem to be happier and more successful. They might not be as numerous. So, do what you like with that information, I suppose. But for myself, aesthetically, it makes sense that monogamy, which is leaning into the R model, or the K model, rather than the R model, generally outcompetes the K model. And of course, sort of related to that, there is existentially nothing you can do or make that is more significant than a child, because a child is the possibility of a chain into the future. Everything else dies. Your line will probably die at some point too, but it's not certain. And it's children are the most complicated and fascinating and interesting. They're like you in most ways. and everything else that we feel compelled to make and create and invest in. Evolution put that desire in us in order to impress a mate so that we might have a kid. That's why that's there. And again, this is I'm not trying to make a naturalistic fallacy. Just because that's why it's there doesn't mean that's what we have to choose. Because again, that goes back to the whole monogamy versus polyamory thing. We have the instinct to do both, but it's a different way of thinking about the significance of children that I think it's harder for young people to grasp, but it becomes more evident as people get older. As people sing that Johnny Cash song about, well, it wasn't originally Johnny Cash, the empire of dirt that we make, or if you're a Christian, basically the entire book of Ecclesiastes, the meaninglessness of our accomplishments in this life become a little bit more prescient when contrasted with the life and vitality of another generation. So, anyways, the benefit to the children, I think, is one reason. And the desire to see these living things grow and to connect with them is sort of an emotional thing that's connected to that. But the second reason, I think, the second evolutionary reason we might be inclined towards monogamy, and I think this is probably the one that will be most compelling to people, is the social pressure. So if one guy gets all the ladies, other men will want to kill him for access to said ladies. So marriage is a kind of compromise that prevents the alpha from being killed by coalitions of non-alphas. It's that simple, and it works. And it'll be curious to see what happens if, in coming decades, if marriage does fall apart and people become polyamorous, and as people have been discovering on Tinder and Bumble and all these other dating apps, not 20% of the guys are getting 80% of the sex, but like 5% of the guys are getting 95% of the sex. That's going to create a lot of resentment. What will come of that? We'll see. But finally, I think and this is a real one too, there's a kind of commitment selection. Red pill guys are often fond of saying women, it's all about sex, and they're hypergamous and they'll cheat on you and all this other stuff. But that runs against like most of what we know about female psychology in nature, in other animals, and in our own species. Women are more likely to make children for a man who commits to her and has the resources to commit to her. So, if a man is showing signs of like, no, I'm here for a long time, versus there's another guy who's just wandering through, some alpha who's like passing by and he's like, oh, look at me, and then he's going to be off somewhere else later. She might have sex with the alpha, but, there are arguments that, she wants the alpha's genes, but the beta's like, support or whatever. But if there is any notion of male paternal recognition, which I think there has been for a while, or rather, maybe the better way of putting it is, men are more willing to commit in circumstances when they can be certain of paternity. So it's not even a matter of whether a man can recognize his own child or not. It's just, if a man can't recognize his own child or can't be certain, then he's less likely to commit. So it makes sense for women to have set up circumstances in such a way that men could be more reasonably certain of paternity in order to facilitate their commitment. And because women want those resources, women are going to get pregnant, and when they are pregnant, they're extremely vulnerable. Those resources mean a lot. And in most cases, men who are the father are happy to provide, and not just in some means to some end, so for the benefit of the kids or whatever. It's like, no, we actually enjoy providing, kind of intrinsically. So anyways, this could also be that commitment selection could also be an alternative hypothesis for the evolution of hidden ovulation. It would be a way for her to have sex with the alpha so he doesn't get upset, but provide offspring for the more committed guy who maybe couldn't fight and beat the alpha, but who she's more likely to get resources from. And appreciate that. This kind of, there's a tragic tendency for people to kind of belittle appreciation and affection as meaningful motivations. And I don't see a good justification for that when you look outside of the human species. Even squirrels and crows understand appreciation and gratitude. The internet abounds in examples of people who've rescued a deer or rescued a squirrel or helped a crow with something, and they're like, now they're friends. People are not, less social than those animals. So, between the benefits to the children and the social pressure, kind of in the negative force, and the commitment selection from women, I think we have three possible evolutionary explanations why monogamy would have grown into something more popular with humans as opposed to our hominoid cousins. But that's not really getting to the heart of the matter, I don't think. Beyond children, beyond evolutionary psych, beyond science, sexual variety, or hypergamy, and sexual monogamy appeal to different parts of us. Sexual variety and hypergamy appeals to our yearning for status and recognition and just pleasure. We want to be that Andrew Tate. We want to be that alpha, or the woman wants to be, the wife of the war chief. That's what the desire for sexual variety and hypergamy come from. Monogamy appeals to a different part of us. It appeals to our desire for connection. So these both exist, but they're not the same parts of ourselves, and they're not equivalent parts of ourselves either. It's not like, I don't think these are like equal and you could choose either one. First of all, the former is, I think, technically less mature. And what I mean is that desire wanes as we age, while the desire for connection tends to grow with age and to become more potent. When I was in my early 20s, I went to, I was sent to, a funny story, therapy. It was a silly ordeal, and the therapist and I quickly became friends, and he agreed, yeah, you don't have a problem. It was a video game question. But we had all kinds of great conversations. He was a wonderful older gentleman. He was in his early 60s. And we got along so well, but he was single. And one of the things that stuck with me from the sessions was talking to him and hearing this longing to have someone from an older and reasonably good-looking, a very charming gentleman. And I remember walking away from those sessions thinking, man, I don't want to be that guy when I get older. Someone who's alone late in life. And I remember feeling that way as a single guy, even in my, early to mid 20s. 98% of the time, freaking awesome, killing it. 2% of the time, crushingly lonely. And I don't think I think it's a rare person who doesn't have that experience, who doesn't experience that desire for connection and intimacy and truly being seen by someone else and seeing them at a deep level. It's hard to talk about this without using sort of platitudinous language, because there isn't really any language that can convey the experience of that kind of relationship. Speaking personally, marriage has changed me profoundly, and it's one of the hardest things, but it's also been one of the best things. And I guess that makes me a biased actor in this endeavor, but then again, aren't we all, I suppose? No one comes into this conversation without a bias of some kind. But I think that this brings us to the question that it's really all about, which is love, right? Love is a hard thing to define, so I'm not going to try to define it. It's something you understand by experiencing it, and that thing that you thought you felt in your late teens, that was not real love. At least it wasn't love yet. It might have grown into real love depending on who you were. But love is something that you come to understand by experiencing it, but that doesn't mean there isn't anything we can say about love. And insofar as love belongs to a person, as in the love of Joe or the love of Sophia or whoever, it is limited by the person's attention. Love without attention is a platitude. It's a meaningless nothing, It's a nice thing you say, but it's not even that nice. Love has something to do with attention. And this was an argument I made in Holy Nihilism, actually, where it was based on the theology that came out of the central verse of the Bible, in my opinion, which is when Jesus was asked what's the greatest commandment, and he gives two. And the greatest commandment is, of course, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your strength. And the second is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, how can you do that if you're loving God with all your heart? And there is a paradox there, and there is a solution to the paradox too, a theological solution with some fascinating implications that permit someone to love God with all their heart and to love their neighbor or their wife at the same time. How they do that is answered in the book, but it doesn't get around the zero-sum, or what I call the zero-sum nature of love, because attention is zero-sum, and love without attention is not real love. Polyamory literally translates to love of many, but this is just kind of the physical expression, right? Now you can love more than one person, but there's a cost, You forgo the ability to and the opportunity to completely and absolutely give yourself to somebody else. To dissolve yourself into another mind, and to be received and recognized and appreciated by that mind, and to feel the other person experience you as their whole world, and for them to do the same to you. You give up that. That's for one person. You can't do that for two or more, So everybody's different. I know several people, both personally, in my circle of friends and from work, just coworkers and stuff, who are not completely monogamous, and they make it work. you know. But the funny thing is, those people generally still have monogamy as a kind of framework. There's this old saying that hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. I think it is funny that the people who are who I know, anyways. I'm sure there's many more people than people in my social circle, but the people I know who have this kind of Dan Savage monogamish sort of lifestyle thing, they still have their one person. That they're operating from a monogamous foundation. And to me, it seems that those people could do just fine without the ish part. They could do just fine without that extra spice. It wouldn't cost them the world for that. But they wouldn't be just fine without that one person. There's a priority, I think, in our soul for the intimacy and connection that comes with one other person, with monogamy. Which is not to say the other desires aren't real, but the cost of not satiating those desires and not feeding them, I think, is much lower. So, again, everyone is different, and some people can make it work, but I think in more cases than not, it just complicates things and invites, if not absolute disaster, then at the very least, trouble that you probably don't want. That wouldn't be worth the brief pleasure. So I think generally speaking, monogamy works better, and not just by social convention, but because it fulfills the higher desires of our soul. It fulfills the longings of the mind rather than just the longings of the body. I'm sorry for the appetites. I'm sorry for relapsing into Platonic language, but I think it's appropriate here. So I hope that has made at least an argument for monogamy and against polyamory. Like what you give up is so much greater, and the cost is so much greater, and what you give up to achieve monogamy, I think, is so much smaller. And that's not to say there isn't a risk. There absolutely is a risk. There's a risk with everything. But as Sexton, the divorce lawyer, says, people keep doing it because the risk is worth it. And I guess that's my case for monogamy over polyamory. I hope that's been helpful. Thanks so much for listening.